Before there was even a Canada, there was the Hudson's Bay Company. Started in 1670 as a pioneer of the North American fur trade, the Bay, as it came to be known, persisted for 355 years, until, as you may have heard, it went bankrupt and sold off nearly all of its locations in 2025. There are many stated reasons for why the Bay failed. COVID, tariffs, a failure to adapt to online shopping, the general irrelevance of in-person shopping centers, the decline of the Canadian middle class. All of those factors are part of it. But the Bay, like many other storied brands before it, was a victim of vulture capitalism, as it was bought, stripped for parts, and then left to die a slow death, all while making profit for the company behind its downfall. So let's look at the decline of Hudson's Bay and companies like it, and how bankrupting companies can be profitable for investors at the top. Before we talk about specific brands, let's look at private equity, and more specifically, leveraged buyouts. A leveraged buyout is when a company, typically a hedge fund or private equity firm, uses largely borrowed funds to acquire an asset. In most leveraged buyouts, about 80% of the funds used come from private investors. A private equity firm charges a management fee to those investors, typically about 2% of the total value. Next, those firms typically take a performance incentive, basically a portion of any gains that might come from the investment, usually about 20% of any profits. But where things get really smart is in who is saddled with the debt. In most cases, the private equity firm will put the debt they took on to acquire the asset onto the books of that asset. So for example, the debt used to acquire Hudson's Bay is put on Hudson's Bay's books, meaning that Hudson's Bay is paying interest payments to the company that purchased them on the debt used to purchase them. Then, finally, these private equity firms often charge the company they acquire a management fee for the expertise they are bringing to the table, while in some cases they are slowly driving the company into the ground through sheer incompetence. Before Hudson's Bay, this played out in another long-standing brand, Sears. Sears, if you may remember, once occupied thousands of stores across North America before going bankrupt in 2018 and vanishing from malls, leaving giant empty storefronts. The prevailing story was that Sears simply couldn't compete in the era of Amazon and had fallen behind the times. In 2005, Eddie Lampert, a hedge fund operator who previously worked doing mergers at Goldman Sachs, merged Sears and Kmart. Lampert made a number of questionable decisions when it came to running Sears. Initially, the hedge fund used cash for stock buybacks, a way that businesses can somewhat artificially inflate the price of their shares and pay dividends to shareholders. From 2005 to 2012, they spent $6 billion on stock buybacks, which generated shareholder value but little else. While they were doing that, and investing in their online stores, Sears in-person stores, where the vast majority of their revenue came from, started literally falling apart. Customers were greeted by stained carpets, cracked displays and floor tiles, and broken down escalators. Many employees went years without a raise, or had their commissions drop to almost nothing. Sears, which had made much of their money from in-person appliance sales, started to lose money year over year. To generate some cash flow, Lampert & Co. started selling off some of Sears' assets in 2012, like a $900 million sale of Sears' tool brand Craftsman to Black & Decker. But the real moneymaker in large retail spaces is real estate. In 2015, Lampert became chair of a real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties. That year, Sears Holdings sold over 266 Sears and Kmart properties for $3 billion to Seritage. Then, the hedge fund separated the real estate and operations side of the business, leaving the operations side to pay rent on the properties it once held. In 2016, Sears paid $200 million in rent to Seritage. As Sears stores went out of business, unable to keep up with rent payments and other debts, Seritage moved in new stores to these properties, charging them over 4 times more per square foot than Sears was paying. Lampert's hedge fund is one of the shareholders of Seritage. For Sears' operations side, due to the rising costs and decreased revenue, they often needed to borrow money. Lampert's hedge fund was there for that too. They acted as a primary lender for Sears' operations, charging them fees and interest while securing the debt to property or inventory, ensuring that even if the company went under, they'd be paid back. Although Lampert was Sears' primary shareholder, debt holders come before shareholders in the case of bankruptcy, meaning his interests were protected either way. It's very difficult to say exactly how much Lampert or his hedge fund profited from the decline of Sears. Some will point to the decline in Lampert's net worth, from $6 to $8 billion at the time of acquisition to around $2 billion afterwards and $1 billion today, to say it cost him $2. Some estimates say, after all is said and done, that Lampert profited nearly $1.4 billion throughout his time at the helm of Sears. But to some extent, how much he profited misses the point. Poor management and vulture capitalism had a huge role in the decline of one of America's most beloved brands. Thousands of people lost their jobs that supported entire families and their pensions. Lampert did just fine. A very similar story played out with Payless Shoes and Toys R Us, who filed for bankruptcy in 2017 due to huge interest payments on their massive debt, while the firms that owned them paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in dividends to themselves just a few years earlier, rather than reinvesting into the company. 20% of companies taken over by a leveraged buyout go bankrupt within 10 years. That's compared to just 2% of companies acquired by any other means. Just 3 years after Lampert bought Sears, a US company called National Realty Development Corp., or NRDC, controlled by Richard Baker, bought the Bay for $1.2 billion, commenting at the time, not at all suspiciously, that they believed the real estate the Bay's stores sat on was worth at least $5 billion. At the time, Hudson's Bay also owned Zellers, a now defunct Canadian discount store chain. In 2011, Hudson's Bay sold 220 Zellers stores to Target for $1.8 billion, more than NRDC had spent on the Bay in the first place. The money was intended to provide substantial cash flow to be reinvested into the department stores. Target tried to expand into Canada, failed, and sold the rest of the Zellers stores to Walmart, resulting in the death of a different Canadian brand. It was the first of many real estate transactions that brought in billions of dollars for Hudson's Bay over the years. But there are significant questions about where that money went. NRDC sold a number of Hudson's Bay properties over the years, perhaps most notably their downtown Toronto store and office tower were sold to Cadillac Fairview for $650 million in 2014. As with Sears, in some cases the rent payments were significantly more than what the Bay had been paying on their mortgage, cutting into their operating expenses. In 2023, Hudson's Bay estimated that their real estate division had been generating between 300 to 500 million USD per year, yet stores were struggling. Despite initial efforts to revitalize the Bay when it was acquired in 2008, including hiring high-profile industry experts and partnering with lucrative brands, insiders speculate that owner Richard Baker had good intentions, but found retail much more difficult than he expected, and so defaulted to what he knew: real estate. The Bay stores started to look just like Sears stores had: stained carpets, broken floor tiles, missing or inconsistent merchandise, no heat in the winter or air conditioning in the summer, and broken escalators. Not to mention staffing cuts, which worsened customer service, which was one of the Bay's main focuses. The 300 to 500 million USD per year was not poured back into Hudson's Bay, but instead at least some of it was used to make other acquisitions. Despite the Bay bleeding cash, NRDC acquired Saks Fifth Avenue, Neiman Marcus, and Bergdorf Goodman, among others. Former executives believe those acquisitions were funded in part from selling off Hudson's Bay real estate. Those additional assets, joined together under the banner of Saks Global, are also in trouble, as it seems Richard Baker is largely good at real estate, but awful at running retail stores. Which is fine, because Saks Global's portfolio contains $7 billion USD in real estate. In the case of Sears and Hudson's Bay and the mountain of other retailers who have gone bankrupt in the last 2 decades, it's overly simplistic to say that private equity or leveraged buyouts are singularly responsible for it all. There's no denying that the retail space has changed dramatically, not to mention a pandemic and global trade instability. But the impact of vulture capitalism cannot be ignored. A failure to adapt, ugly or dilapidated stores, layoffs, poor management, decreased operations budgets because of expensive rent payments are consistent outcomes from private equity takeovers. Companies are not only able to profit off of this, but are incentivized to continue the cycle. In North America, corporate interest payments are tax deductible, meaning taxpayers are subsidizing the very hedge funds or private equity firms that may likely gut their employer and cost them their job. Although this was limited to interest payments over 30% of a company's earnings in the US, real estate companies are exempt. And the debt of these companies are almost always insured, meaning that when a company goes out of business and has to liquidate, the sale of their assets ensures that the company makes its money back. In that same situation, there's a huge portion of debt that isn't insured. That debt? Workers' wages and pensions. Over 9,000 workers will lose their jobs as Hudson's Bay closes. There have been calls for lawmakers to protect workers and companies from these kinds of deals for years, but very little has been done. After all, in capitalism, why shouldn't an investor be allowed to drive a company into the ground through their incompetence? But the big takeaway is that the rich investors behind these deals always find a way to either profit or at least make back their money, while everyday workers are left without a job, or in many cases a pension they've spent decades building, and is their only hope of retirement. The loss of a storied Canadian brand is just one of the tragedies at play in the death of Hudson's Bay. But one thing we can be sure of, the Bay is not the first brand to be gutted and destroyed by vulture capitalism, and it certainly won't be the last.